In this video, we'll go over the basics of Flexbox in CSS. And thanks for checking out this video. We're going to go over the basic Flexbox properties. And if you're just starting or even thinking about starting a career in web development, you're in the right place. I upload new videos every week. Hit subscribe and the bell to get notified. And stick around to the end and I'll show you how to build this, a responsive image grid. So what is Flexbox? Flexbox is a layout mode in CSS3. It provides a more efficient way to lay out, align, and distribute space among items in a container, even when their size is unknown or even dynamic. And that's why it's called Flexbox. Before Flexbox, there were 4 layout modes. There was the block layout for laying out documents, the inline layout for laying out text, position layout for explicit positioning, and the table layout for laying out 2D tabular data. So you may be wondering, what about floats? Well, floats were actually never intended for layout. They were a CSS recreation of the old align attribute in HTML. Now, smart web developers found ways to abuse them to create complex layouts, but it's not ideal, as anyone who's forgotten a clear fix knows. Alright, let's look at some code. So I've got VS Code set up here, and I've got an index.html file, and I'm running live server so we can see this in real time. Let me show you the HTML here. It's very simple. So in the body, we have a div with the class of Flexbox container, and within that we have 3 divs. And then in the CSS, it's very basic as well. I don't have anything in the Flexbox container so far. The Flexbox item, I've set a width, some background color, border, color, font size, padding, and margin, just very basic stuff. And then in each item, I've specified a minimum height. So we've got 50 pixels on item 1, 100 pixels on item 2, and 250 pixels on item 3. So right now on our web page we have the 3 divs, and they are all aligned horizontally as you would expect with divs. Divs always start on a new line. So what we can do in this Flexbox container, we can add a property of display flex. And then what that does is it creates a Flexbox container, and everything within that container is then put onto a row by default. We can specify that this should be a column, but by default it is a row. And to help you see everything that's going on here, I set up some CSS and an external style sheet as well. So I'll uncomment that and save it. And so now you see the container div. So one thing to note about Flexbox is that the Flexbox layout is directionally agnostic, as opposed to the block layout, which is vertically based, or the inline layout, which is horizontally based. So in Flexbox, we have 2 axes. The main axis always follows the direction of the Flexbox. So this Flexbox is set up as a row by default, so the main axis would go horizontally. And so to demonstrate those axes, I've also set up some code, and I'll paste that in here and then save that. And now you see the main axis always goes along with the direction of the Flexbox. So this is a row, the cross axis would be vertical. So if this was set up as a column, the main axis would then be vertical and the cross would be horizontal. And this will make more sense in just a minute. So if we go back up here to the container, notice that the child divs are all aligned to the left, and that is by default as well. So there is a property called justify content, and you see several options here. So flex start is the default. We could set it to flex end, and I'll save that. And now you'll see that it aligns along the main axis to the end, which is all the way to the right. Another option here is center. So it will then center along the main axis. There's a couple of other useful values, which are space between. So that divides the available space equally between each element. You'll notice that on the sides there is no additional spacing besides the padding and margin that we've added. So another one that we could do is space around, and then that divides equally around all sides of the child objects. And then another one is space evenly, and that will evenly space each element along the main axis. So just remember that justify content is always referring to the main axis. It could be vertical or it could be horizontal depending on the direction of the Flexbox. Alright, so that's the main axis. Now let's look at the cross axis. So for the cross axis, we will use align items. And by default, this is set to stretch. So you'll notice that we have assigned a minimum height to each one of these items, but each of them are exactly the same size. So the default here again is stretch. So let's change that to flex start. And I'll save that. And now you'll notice that along the cross axis, it has now aligned the items flex start at the top. They're not stretched to fill. So I can change that to flex end. And now they are aligned along the cross axis at the bottom, or the end of the cross axis. We can also change it to center, and it will align them on the center of the cross axis. So then again, just remember, justify content is for aligning along the main axis. Align items is for aligning along the cross axis. Alright, I'm going to get rid of these axis markers. I don't think we need them anymore. Alright, let's set these to 50%. And you'll notice that these are not 50%. And watch what happens when we shrink and expand the window. Again, they are not 50%. Now Flexbox is doing what it's supposed to here. So there is another property that we can add, and that is Flex Wrap. And by default, it is set to no wrap. So right now it's squishing everything together. So let's set this to wrap. And I'll save that. And so since each one is set to 50%, it's now wrapping each one. So let's take this down to 25%. And now you'll see that it can fit two on a row, and then the third one, it can't fit, so it wraps that one below. And with wrap turned on, there's another property that we can look at, and that is align content. And for now, I'll set it to center. And you'll notice when I save that nothing happened. So in order to demonstrate this, I'll need to add a height property, and I will make the height of the container 95 of the view height. And now you'll notice that everything is centered. So align items aligns each item to each other. Align content aligns the entire group within the container. So if I change align content to flex start, they will all align to the top. And flex end, that will align everything to the bottom. So to demonstrate this again, I can change this to 15%, get everything on the same line, and now it's easier to see that align items is centering each item to each other, but align content is aligning the entire group to the end of the container. Align content has the same available values as justify content. So we could set this to space around, and it evenly distributes the space on the top and the bottom of the entire group. So if we change this width back to 25% to get the row to wrap, now you'll notice that it has spaced around each row of the group. So number 3 has wrapped down to a new row. So the space is even on the top, in the middle, and on the bottom. So if we change this to space between, you'll see that now there's no additional space on the top or bottom. It's all in between the two rows. Change this back to center, and now the entire group is centered. Okay, there's a couple more properties that we need to cover for the container. So what I will do is I'm going to get rid of everything here, and we'll add a flex direction. So this is where you can tell it if it's a row or a column. So by default, it is set to row. And there is something called row reverse, which takes the row and reverses it. Same with column. There's a column reverse. I've never used those. So you'll mostly use either row or column. So let's set this to column, and I'll save that. And now you'll see it looks just like it did before we added flex to this container. So again, let me add a height here, and we will again set this to 95 view height. And you'll see now there's some extra space at the bottom. So in this column, we can do a justify content. Now remember, justify content goes along the main axis, And now since we're set up as a column, the main axis is going vertical. So we'll set this to center, and let's see what happens. It aligns the column now in the center along the main axis. We can change this to space around. So now it adds space around each object. Do space between, and now it evenly distributes the space in between. We can also add align items, and let's center that. And that aligns the column to the center of the cross axis, and the cross axis is now horizontal. There's one more item that we could assign to the container, and that is flex flow. Now flex flow is a combination of the flex direction and flex wrap. So we could say column and wrap. That would be the same as flex direction and flex wrap here. So if I save that, you'll notice nothing changed. So I can actually delete these two lines here and have it here on one line, flex flow, column, wrap. So those are the basic properties for the container. Let's move on now to the properties that we can assign to the child items. To do that, I'm going to just delete these things and go back to a normal Flexbox. Alright, and let's change these back to 15%, make them a little bit narrower so that we can have some extra space in this container. So something that we could assign to a child element is flex grow. And if I set that to 1, watch what happens. Item 1 now grows to fill all of the available space. And if I set that on item 2, now they evenly distribute the space between 1 and 2. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. And I can do the same thing here. Flex grow, set that to 1. So now they're evenly growing to fit the available space. If I wanted 2 to be a little bit bigger, I could set item 2 to 2. And now it is a little bit larger. It's distributing the available space at a 2-to-1 ratio. And to make this a little bit more apparent, we can change this one to, let's change it to 4 times. So it's a 4-to-1 ratio, save that. And now if we resize the browser, you'll notice that it is growing 4 times as much as 1 and 3. Now once we get below that 15% width threshold that we've set, they're all going to be even. But there is another property that we can set to manage that as well. So we could set flex shrink. And we'll set that to 1 here. We'll add flex shrink, and we'll set this one again to 4. And flex shrink, and set this one to 1. So grow acts when the items don't completely fill the container. That's when grow activates. Shrink activates when the items become smaller than the width that they are set to. So as I decrease the window, you'll notice that number 2 is smaller now than 1 and 3. To demonstrate that a little bit better, let me make these wider. I'll set these to 25%. And now when we start to shrink, you'll notice that number 2 shrinks 4 times as much as 1 and 3. Okay, so that's grow and shrink. And now instead of setting the width, there's actually something called a flex basis. So we can add this to the flex item, which is all of the child elements. It's flex basis. And if I set that to 25%, you'll notice that nothing changes, but I can actually get rid of this width here. And still nothing changes. So we'll set this back down to 15%. And there you go. Flex basis is the starting point of the item's width. So another way that we could write this, I'll remove it from the Flexbox item, and I'm going to remove all of the grow and shrinks from each item. And we can write all of this in one line. So just flex. The first property here is the grow, so we can set that to 1. And the shrink, we'll set that to 1 as well. And then the flex basis, and we'll set that to 15%. On the second item, we will do flex, and I'm going to do this 1, 1, and 25. And on the third one, I'm going to do flex, and let's do 5, 5, and 25. Alright, now I'll save that. So now you'll see that 1 is 15%, and these are 25%. But the third item is set to grow and shrink 5 times as much as the first two. So let's resize the browser, and you'll see 3 is growing 5 times as much as 2, and shrinking 5 times as much. Now another item that we could assign here is align self. So this would be on the child item, align self, and let's say center, and save that. And so now again, that the default here on this row is stretch, but we can go to individual child elements and specify an align self and tell it where we want it to align. So we could say center on this one, and this one we could say align self to flex end, and this one we will align self to flex start. Since the container is not larger than the third item, it is taking up the entire height. So if we go back to the container and we add a height, and we'll add that 95 view height back. And now you can more easily see item 1 is in the center, item 2 is at the end, and item 3 is at the start. Now another thing that used to be pretty difficult in CSS was aligning something perfectly in the center of an element. With Flexbox, it's pretty easy. So we have these numbers here, and they are all in the top left corner. So the flex item is a child of the main container, but we can have multiple flex containers within flex containers. So we're going to turn the children into flex containers as well. So we're going to display flex, and I'll save that, and you'll notice that nothing happened. So now we will justify content center and align items center, and watch what happens. Now the content of the children are aligned perfectly in the center. Alright, the last property that we will discuss is ordering. So we can actually change the order of these items without changing the HTML. Normally you would come down to the HTML and cut and paste and move these items around, but we can actually specify that in the CSS. So to demonstrate that, let's say that this first container is the main content of your website. And then the second container is the left aside, so the left sidebar. And the third one was going to be the right aside, and that's the right sidebar. So for the purposes of SEO, you may set up your HTML this way so that when Google goes through your web page, it sees your main content first and not the sidebar. And another reason could be for screen readers. The CSS would not apply to screen readers, so the ordering of your HTML actually matters. But in the CSS, we can come up here and we can assign an order, and we want item 1 to actually be number 2, because that is our main content, and we're going to want that in the middle of the page. And so now we come down to item 2, and we want the order of this one to be 1. We want it to be first on the left side of the page. And then we can say order 3 for the last one. It is going to remain on the right side. So now if I save that, now you'll see we have left, main, and right. And just to make this easier, let's set all of these back to stretch. That stretch is the default. Actually, I could just delete them. Delete all of these align selves. And now you can see left, main, and right. Alright, so now let's look at a real-world example. So I've got this grid HTML that I've created, and let's go through the HTML portion first. So in the body, we've just got a header with some text. There's a single row, and then within the row we've got columns. This div column has images. Each one has a bunch of stock images. So there's 4 columns, and that's it. Pretty simple. We've got a column class and a row class. So let's go up to the CSS. So we're just setting everything with the box sizing of border box to mitigate any margin and padding issues. Body, margin 0, font family, header. All the stuff at the top here is pretty standard. So then we go down to the row and we've got a display flex and a wrap. And then on the column, we're doing a flex 25%. So we're not setting the grow or the shrink. We're just setting the flex basis here. And then on the column image, we've got some padding. We want the width to be 100% of the available width, and vertical align middle just to make everything even. And then we've got a couple of media settings here. Max width of 800 pixels. So that means anything under 800 pixels, we're going to change the column flex to 50%. So initially it's set to 25% so that we can have 4 columns. If the media width is less than 800 pixels though, we only want 2 columns. And then if the media is less than 600 pixels, we want the column to then be a single column, so 100%. Alright, so let's take a look at this in the browser. Alright, so right now we're under 600 pixels, so it's 1 column. Right? So let me resize the browser. And as soon as I get over 600 pixels, it goes to 2 column. And then we'll increase it to over 800, and now we're set to 4 column. Alright, so it's pretty simple to create these flex boxes and align things and center things and adjust things exactly how you want them. And so that's all that we're going to cover in this video. I have some more advanced CSS videos on the way. So hopefully this video helped you. If you enjoyed it, a like is appreciated. If you want to see more content like this, subscribe and hit the bell. And I'm on Twitter and Instagram at CodeStacker. Thanks for watching.